Hi, everybody. Good evening and welcome to the Ethics of Now at Home. It's like the Ethics of Now that we used to do at the Durham Arts Council, but instead of being in the Durham Arts Council, we are in my office at home. We at Keenan, as you know, decided to do the webinar series because we realized that physical distancing does not mean disengagement. And that in a moment such as this, at a moment of the pandemic, that we needed to be flexing our sort of ethical muscles and working on our moral imaginations. So that's what we're up to. And tonight we're going to be doing it with my guest, Wayne Norman. Wayne is the Mike and Ruth Mackowski Professor of Ethics at the Keenan Institute for Ethics and at the Department of Philosophy here at Duke University. He's a political philosopher who teaches courses in business ethics, sports ethics, and the philosophy of play and humor. His work in political philosophy focuses mostly on the special challenges that arise in multicultural societies where citizens have diverse and overlapping identities and attachments. He's been most interested in states that incorporate more than one people or nation within its own historic homeland, as more than 90% of countries do. He's the author of Negotiating Nationalism, Nation Building, Federalism, and Secession in the Multinational State, and the co-editor or author of 4 other books. He's currently writing a book entitled The Ethical Adversary: How to Play Fair When You're Playing to Win in Sports, Business, Politics, Law, and Love, which Wayne covers pretty much everything. Before arriving at Duke almost 13 years ago, he held distinguished professorships at the University of Montreal and at the University of British Columbia. So before we start our conversation, I just want to quickly run folks through how this is going to go. We'll talk for roughly 35 minutes or so. We'll talk until about 7:40. The audience will see the 2 of us. They'll see host and guest. But there'll be plenty of other folks on hand from Keenan to kind of move things along for support to deal with Zoom, unexpected plot twists, what have you. Y'all, the audience, will ask questions through the Q&A tool. The chat function is disabled, but we will gather your questions through the Q&A tool and try to address as many as time allows. Then, when this is all over, after tonight's webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording of the conversation. I think that covers all of our business stuff. Let us get to talking. And I wanted to start with a question, that I think many people might ask, but I think that we're both well equipped to answer, right? Which is, why are we even having this conversation, right? Of all of the things when facing a pandemic and perhaps an economic recession that we might address, is there a value or even a validity in talking about something that we might think of as frivolous, like sports?
Yeah, well, of course it's not frivolous, but no, it is frivolous in the greater scheme of things.
Everything is frivolous in the greater scheme of things, Wayne.
Yeah, so I think when I saw a Facebook announcement from Keenan about this event, it might even have been the first comment said, like, that's not difficult. This is much more important. The pandemic is much more important than sports. If seasons don't have to happen, I like sports as much as the next person. I'm really paraphrasing here now because it was very succinct in only 2 sentences, but something like, I like sports as much as the next person, but really, I mean, this is a no-brainer. If they don't have sports for another year, it's not gonna be a big deal. And I must admit that I actually feel uncomfortable, making even social media posts amongst my friends about almost anything that's even pleasant in my life right now. So any upside of the pandemic or something like that, you don't even want to talk about it. I mean, there's so many people that have been hit so hard that it feels it feels like it would be painful to them, and feels almost like a kind of gloating. And similarly, I think in some ways when people, especially sports fans, talk about sports, if they're talking in too serious and heavy and lamenting way about it, it makes it seem like they're just pampered children because people have lost things much more than, their games on TV. So it is difficult to broach the subject, but I hope we'll be able to somehow, because we have another half an hour or so to talk. But there are serious questions, and there are serious questions that arise. What to do with college athletes, and how much risk should they be asked to do to perform revenue earning sports for their universities or something. And there are other things which I hope we can get to, which is if you're a diehard sports fan and you've kind of gone cold turkey now for almost 2 months and are looking forward to perhaps a whole summer like this, what have you learned about your need for sports? What you thought was a need? Has it been confirmed? Have you realized that it was just a kind of addiction that in some sense, once you're freed of it, you're happy, that kind of thing. So I think we have reflections of that sort about a lot of activities that we formerly did as a regular part of our habit, haven't done them now for 2 months, and where it's time to kind of reflect on, how important was that thing?
Well, so I want to get to both of those questions and this last question first, but I was just going to say, as we were talking, that when you said you feel guilty about mentioning sports or anything mentioning life, that I think underlying our question and a sort of more general response to the sort of recoiling at the frivolity is a deeper, harder question about how do we live, right? How do we claim that we are not limited to and defined by this pandemic, while also acknowledging the seriousness, the magnitude, and the somberness of the effect of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like what role do all those quote unquote trivial things have in a life, in the kind of life one envisages for oneself, the way one thinks one can use one's time well in a way that you're not ashamed of and it's enjoyable? Is how important are those things in the greater scheme of things? There was and I didn't read much past the headline and the pop-out blurb, but I take it that there was a blog post or something by Ezekiel Emanuel, who is one of the big NIH gurus of everything to do with public health. And I think it was along the lines of, why do people all want to live so long anyway? It seems to me that old folks, all they do is like leisure activities. Is that really that more important or meaningful? And this is this is an old, long-standing philosophical position that really work and contributions and also religious, that your kind of work, you're giving back, you're making things better for others, etc. That's the meaningful things in life, and these other things are less so. But I kind of bristled when I read the headline. It might be why I didn't read the rest of it. But there's so many COVID-related things to read now that you can't dive down every rabbit hole.
I mean, the way that I think about it, or what I liken it to, I just finished teaching a first-year seminar, so to students who had a weird end to their first year of college, but were in their first year of college, on Black life. And we did a lot of things with the sort of, the terroristic low points of American history in terms of African-American history. So lynching or mob violence or what have you. But I would also assign books on fashion, or a book that's just about a marriage and it's just the story of a marriage, right? Because what I wanted to say to them is that living, even for people who are living within and around and immersed in difficulty, is not solely suffering, and that many people actually claim their senses of themselves by not being defined by that suffering. And so there is a way to respect that by going with them to the lighter places that they are reaching for and going to, right? And maybe even that's too heavy for talking about sports, but maybe it's not, right?
And those aren't all light places. I mean, was it An American Marriage? Was that one of the books that you were thinking of, or not necessarily?
We did do that one, although that one is disrupted by and I guess actually the book that I chose, because I think the romance in it and the love in it is really gorgeous, is Elizabeth Alexander's The Light of the World. And that's a book that's about her husband dying unexpectedly. So it's also a book about loss, but the thing that you carry, the way that you sort of move through the loss is to sort of immerse yourself in their love for a little while.
Yeah, I think my version of that, this pandemic, is I've worked my way in 2 or 3 weeks through the 20 hours of Ken Burns's jazz series that's now about 20 years old. And it's, in the main, it's a life-affirming celebration of, the greatest American art form and the most African-American of contributions to American popular culture. But of course, it is also a way of chronicling the history of racism through, several decades as it, I was going to say evolved, but actually barely evolved, and by the time they left off. So yeah, there's no getting away from the deeper, even if one's trying to talk about the things that add sparkle and icing to our lives.
I mean, to go back to the Ken Burns documentary, right? Like his baseball documentary series does a similar thing. And so maybe that tracks us back to this conversation about sports, right? Which is, what is, we could actually talk, sports is not necessarily life affirming. It's something adrenaline affirming. It's engagement. It creates certain kind of community. Like what does sports do for people and for communities? And then what does this pause, this moment to pull back and think about one's relationship to sports, does it change then, like having a time to reflect on this, does it then change what sports does for people and communities?
Mm-hmm. Well, my view is that sports really kind of, I announced it as my view, so I should actually have the words to put this into words. But that sports really models and mimics and plays out and puts in its narrative so many different features of the human experience. The struggle to compete, the camaraderie of teamsmanship, the necessity of kind of rules of sportsmanship, the necessity of regulations and arbiters, and the joyful emotions and ugly emotions, and so many different things are kind of wrapped up in that, and they're things that almost every sports fan is picking up on, and they're part of the experience, and some of them more than others. So I think when we're, I think in some ways that there is something just so easily digestible about sports on TV. It just, people often watch it very much at the time where they really want to kind of turn off something else in their brain. They want to sit back. They want to let it come at them, and largely sort of take it in. And sports television packages narratives and stories and emotions and everything to do that for us. So when that's cut off, we can sort of think about many of the things that one sees and learns about in some sense in sports, and see how much they matter in our everyday lives. Like how do we feel when we go to the grocery store and whole aisles are empty because our teammates, our fellow citizens, have forgotten about the team, and they have to just grab. Or conversely, when we hear lots. It seems that we get Spectrum cable at home, and please don't cut off my internet while I'm talking. Anyways, but Spectrum cable, they use their local news largely for kind of feel-good stories, actually, of sort of people pitching in and acting more like a team. And often we see even the language of that kind of cooperative language, sometimes using sports metaphors involved. Sometimes they'll pick stories that involve athletes who are professional athletes or something, who are doing something within their community and using that. So I think it is, what we see in sports is woven into the way we interpret lots of other things in life, in part because so many things are competitive and so many things require cooperation of people who we think are on our side.
So you're writing this book, you said that the sort of the ethical adversary, right? And I imagine that sort of you're thinking about sports and you're thinking about what like adversarial relationships that work or that follow some ethical model are bound up in one another. Um, is sports a site for building people's ethical, like for both building their ethical imagination and schooling their ethical practice? And and I guess both participation in, but we're talking about spectator sports. So as someone who is, what can we get in this moment from, I mean, I guess we can't watch people like sort of, but from yearning for, like, what are the spectator, like, what is the participant getting? What is the athlete getting out of sports? And I know that it depends a little bit on the sport that you're talking about. And then what does the spectator get? And is there something we can still get in this time when everything's on pause?
Yeah, I think there are two completely different questions in a way. And
you mean the athlete and the
yeah. And even, I mean, whether it's the professional athlete or even the, you know, in some ways the purest form of sports participation is in pickup sports, which are, you know, kind of entirely governed and refereed by the agreement amongst the people playing. Right. It may be one of the purest forms and of good sportsmanship, et cetera. But I think at any rate, there's a long history of going back to the Greeks, really, of trying to make sense of the role of sports and competition in the education and maturing and growing skill set of future citizens. It's certainly something that was imbued in the philosophy of the NCAA from its beginning and beyond. In many societies, including the Greeks, it was almost certainly mostly about producing eventual warriors. But so there is this sense that that one learns from playing sports all sorts of life lessons about cooperation and playing a role within a team, but also about how to be engaged in a competition where it has clear boundaries of when you're competing against that person, when you're not, and that your rival is not an enemy, for example, that you engage in this kind of competition, and that's whether you're a courtroom lawyer, or whether you're want to be considered an ethical business person, or want to be considered one of the good kind of politicians or something, that you don't see your opponents as enemies, that there are rules, that there's a kind of arena in which you're engaged in that competition, but it has limits and you can step outside that and treat each other as people. So I think that's the sense that I think that there really is a real sense in which we can learn some of those boundaries, some of those roles, and some of, if you will, the kind of artificiality of the game or the competition. Yeah.
So, although, did you read about or see The Last Dance? Right? Because there's a way in which I'm thinking that that those rules don't always apply. Because my takeaway from that was like, oh, I think the Pistons hated the Bulls, hated, you know. Yeah. And maybe that's striking because it seems the sort of exception to the norm. But
I think so. Yeah. Okay. I mean, it's a very common trope in all sorts of backward-looking documentaries about great rivalries in sport.
Right.
And I don't know. I guess I'm kind of old-fashioned, but it really warms my heart when you have one of those documentaries and it looks back at these people who were for a quote-unquote generation, which often means 5 or 10 years, right, seen as bitter rivals, and lots of narratives were about their epic battles. So it's interesting when we talk about great sports moments, we tend to use war metaphors. And then when we talk about almost anything else, we use sports metaphors. But it's always nice when you see the segment where they have the two old rivals together and they're kind of backslapping and they look back and they realize that it was really a very elaborate form of cooperation, that they needed each other. They needed each other to be trying as hard as they did to bring out the best in each other. And that is really kind of the most, like, that's the ultimate in like sporting rationale, if you will. That is the point of playing sports in some ways. In its most ideal way, it's to to be engaged in a mutual pursuit of excellence with your rival, and realize that you need them and they need you, and they need you at your best, or otherwise it's just not fun. It's not, valuable. So I think going back to the documentary now, so that of course it makes a great narrative on TV when you find that actually it was so intense, the rivalry, that they never were able to kind of, overcome it, or maybe something was done, maybe not on the court or on the field itself, that they can't forget, or what have you. So there's kind of, it would be a shame if it was because of, what was done on the court, and it was something that was legal, and somewhat, then we just call the person a sore loser or whatever.
Right.
Or what, but yeah, but I do think those are the kind of lessons that come across and that strike us as interesting and even deep, because we recognize that there is kind of an ideal way in which athletes or rivals of any kind really should be putting that rivalry into context.
But that's not how fans necessarily, like, that's what athletes do indeed. It's not necessarily what fans. So what is the community of fandom, right? And what is it? And what is that community producing for people? And what does that community start looking like when when we're all at home, like imagining or remembering the great games in our heads?
Yeah. It sounds so sad the way you.
I'm sorry. I meant.
I mean, I think, there are so many different kinds of fans, and I think people who don't like sports or are actually put off, by some particular kinds of fandom, will tend to generalize it across all fans. So that
I should say, I am married to someone who defines himself as a member of Red Sox Nation. So that is my understanding of.
Yeah. So that one is potentially one of the problematic ones. Yeah. It seems to share something in common with lots of Boston.
Let us hope that he never watches this webinar.
No. I mean, so the way people often want to describe a particular kind of fandom like that is that it's sort of tribal. That it's just, all I care about is my group triumphing over all other groups, or over that particular one sometimes. I mean, sometimes it doesn't even matter that they win championships. They just need to be better than them. And I think that, in a way that also mimics, or that models the emotion of a particular kind of competitiveness that most people who think of competitiveness as a kind of, not a human virtue, but a failing of some kind, it's because they think of this subgenre of competitiveness, or of the drive to compete, which used to be given the word emulation, really until the 1950s. Emulation meant the emotion to one up, to better, and to show that I'm the king of the castle and you're the dirty rascal, and I'm better than you, ha, 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 ha. And people that just are driven by wanting to be better than somebody else, or better than others. Whereas actually one's ideal of maybe the most virtuous athlete is one who kind of plays the game for the reasons I was talking about earlier. Like, they want a good opponent, and they want that because it's a mutual quest for excellence, and they want to bring out the best they can in themselves and see what they can accomplish. And that kind of person almost doesn't care in the extreme whether they win or lose. They may even forget whether they won or lost. There were some epic matches, but one in particular between Nadal and Federer,
right.
A few years ago, and actually there've been a number of tennis matches that have, some of the ones that have gone, like there was one that went 117. It's been so long since I watched tennis now. I'm trying to remember what they call each. What do they call each round? No, games. I guess it was like games at the end. Yeah, for a tiebreaker. And often, and some of those at the end of some of those matches, and tennis is kind of an interesting example of this. You'll see the two like embrace each other over the net, almost propping each other up, and just grateful to have participated in such a thing. And and the spectator won't even really remember who won that match. It didn't,
Right.
it was, and the winner will express seemingly genuinely that, you know, nobody deserved to lose this match. You know, he deserved it as much as me. I almost feel embarrassed to have come out of it the winner, where it seemed like the appropriate end of that situation should have been a draw. I don't know how this got started, but that's what we think of as kind of the ideals of competition and ideals of sporting competition, that you can compartmentalize and really constrain what the competition is actually about, and also what the ego is doing with the competition and driving it. And it contrasts with that kind of, you know, which one sees in I think the most kind of hooliganish, tribal sort of fan bases in various sports at various times, where
among the thugs,
yeah, it really just is about us winning and us being able to have bragging rights. I mean, that expression that's used very often, you know, to win bragging rights or something. I mean, the Duke UNC basketball thing is kind of interesting in this respect, because I think, I mean, there are lots of forces that are in place to curate exactly what that kind of emotional experience is. But there is you know, it does try to be the height of kind of, in a way, tribalistic rivalry that nevertheless does not, you know, very rarely seems to spill over into an actual animosity between two actual people, whether players or students. It's something that they enjoy, the rivalry. They need the rivalry. They need the other team to be good. So there is something kind of heartening about that when it works.
And I mean, and it still exists within the space, both within the space of the stadium or within the space of the living room, the sort of broader extended stadium where people are screaming at their TVs. And so, I mean, one of the questions that we had for this conversation was like, what becomes of this? What is it reasonable? Like, what do we anticipate things looking like in the next several months? What is it reasonable to ask of athletes? And then, I mean, not to go back to the sort of earlier question about frivolity, but is there some level in which it's crazy to even try to make this work?
Yeah, so there's, you know, we're now, I was going to say, we're now actually seeing a couple of professional sports leagues around the world finding a way of coming back and playing with lots of safety precautions for the players and employees of the teams, and no fans in the stadiums. So I haven't managed to, I think Korean baseball is already on ESPN. Apparently it's on in the early mornings and late nights. It may have just started this week. And it hasn't yet worked its way into my COVID statistic checking, morning checking routine yet to sort of actually turn it on. But apparently there is Korean professional baseball with some American players playing before empty stadiums, and the German Bundesliga as well is going back. But so one of the issues is, well, there are a couple of things. I think there's two sets. One is there's a lot of issues that are raised by the dangers to players, employees, and indirectly and directly the general public from these events going on, or these leagues restarting. And then there's another set of questions, which is, what would it feel like to kind of be watching your favorite sport on TV in these empty arenas or stadiums where you can hear every player talking and the whistles are echoing around, and they're having to kind of find a way of muting the swearing between players and things like that. So those are two completely different set of questions, but I think they're, for the second, the trivial, if you will.
I mean, it's not trivial. I think we should, but.
Yeah, no, I think, so it teaches us, I've started to think that it teaches us something kind of interesting. So the last sporting event I saw before they went dark was, there were two Champions League games between some top European soccer clubs that were going on. They play in the evening in Europe, and they're broadcast live over here at about 3 p.m. on Wednesdays and Thursdays. So it was just the day or so before I think that an NBA player tested positive and that league shut down, and kind of 3 days before everything in the world shut down. But on that last Champions League day, I was flipping back and forth between two games. One that was in Liverpool that looked like any other game has ever been, with a stadium full of nonstop cheering and singing fans, and all of the ambiance that brings to the television broadcast. And the other in Paris, in a completely empty stadium, that where the broadcasters didn't even have any time to think about how they would cover the game differently. They just had their microphones and cameras in position, and they just did it. And it was the weirdest, strangest thing to watch. And I kept going back to the other game, not so much because I wanted to see it, but just it felt obviously more comfortable for me. It was too weird. I felt like I was a voyeur almost, like I wasn't supposed to be there. You know, what am I doing here? Whereas the other, otherwise, and then I realized that how much it is that the broadcasters have always, for all of these sporting events, the way they broadcast. So we may see a little segment in a studio somewhere, and then typically before the game starts, we cut to some picture of the people calling the game in front of a green screen that looks down on the stadium, or just sideline reporters and things. We hear the crowd all the way through. And I realized that that's doing a lot more for us than we probably ever thought about, just because it's always been there. And so what is it doing? I asked myself. And I presume that what it's doing is making us, without even unconsciously, completely feel that we're engaged in a social experience with our people, and that we're not alone in the world. We're with all those people watching them. Because as soon as you take those away, and all of a sudden you feel intensely alone in front of your TV. So that's weird. That's kind of interesting. That's one of those things that we might kind of reflect on. You know, is that a real thing that we're getting, or is it something that they're feeding us to not make us realize that in fact we're just sitting alone, eating junk food and drinking beer in front of a screen? We're not really, these people aren't really our friends. We're not really part of that scene. I'm not sure what to think about that, really. That's one of the things.
Well, I imagine that that usually with questions like that, the answer lies somewhere in between. But that, I mean, is it any kind of shared passion for something? It can be the basis of a connection, or it can be the beginning of a connection. And like, you have things that are of varying kind of tightness, right? Or permanence in all of one's relationships. But the relationship with the game that you're watching, with the team that's playing, or with the sport that's being played, is an on-ramp onto, it's a route to other forms of connection, right?
Yeah. And what, you know, among those are just as talking points, as things to talk about with other people. Even so, now we're doing that. You know, everybody's doing that with Netflix series. They just are burning through these things, desperately looking for new ones, getting advice. Because especially, so there are lots of things, these things where we really want to talk to other people about it. You know, we watch a bunch of episodes. Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, the same thing that we're asking right now, the sort of like, why do we think about sports so much? I would say the same thing, but the number of times I've said to people, why am I watching Joe Exotic? And am I a bad person? Right? Like, I think that the answer no, sports are part of, are in the warp of community and leisure and how we do things. Like, it's far more defensible than most of the other ways that I spend my time when I'm not doing work, which, no one can do all the time. I wanted to also, before we turn and start taking questions, is actually to think a little bit about what sports do for campuses specifically, right? And what it's going to mean. Like, what is a university? Ours, certainly, but then others, like, what is not just the social life, but again, the social life and community and sort of like the student bonding or what have you, how does that look if sports don't return in full? And this came up because my daughter, who is 11, was basically like, well, they can't have Shasheskyville anymore. which for anyone who doesn't know is the strange Duke tent city that students build and sleep in to get basketball tickets, which my other child looked at one day and was like, that looks like a Civil War refugee camp, right? Like like you can see the bad health floating around, the miasma of germs sort of floating around it, even in the best of circumstances, right? But I can't imagine Duke students conceiving of being undergraduates without K-ville.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing having to take classes online when you paid for something more. It's another having to do that and not being able to go to basketball games or in some cases football games. There's different elements to it. So one is about the athletes themselves. And again, that varies across sports, but if you take the quote unquote revenue sports, that they came here with certain promises, and it's part of career training for many of them. By far those, the minority of all the student athletes, but at any rate for lots, it is a pretty important, part of the training for the career that they aspire to, and that we as an institution made promises about. Right. So, and I like going down in the spring term, I did have at least a couple of students in one course who were in that situation. So they were quarantined for the last, month or month and a half of the course. They were like FaceTiming with their strength coaches and things like that, and still trying to do some training but also, thinking and hearing things and rumors about what will happen in the fall and whether it will work out. But so for the athletes, they have their own particular kinds of anxieties about that. For the camp, I mean, that just American campuses for more than 100 years have used sports as a very, and none perhaps more successfully than Duke, as a strong component of a kind of identity building exercise that makes people, by the time they leave here, bleed blue, so to speak. And that's been going around all around American campuses really for 100 years. It's when students come often and say as graduate students from other countries, it's baffling. You have to kind of start from scratch to try and explain to them why this works. You have to kind of explain the whole structure of professional leagues and how these college sports in some cases are development leagues for the pros, and it's still kind of baffling until they eventually just drink enough of the potion, and then they often get into it as well. But that's something that is part of the Duke experience, and it's part of what it sells. I would guess if you look at the brochures and videos that Duke puts out in recruitment period for undergraduates, that will be part of the story. So and that will happen across campuses. I mean, I imagine in sort of the big football colleges in the SEC and things like that, it's many people's reason for having chosen that college. So that will be, and that will be, I guess we can think it will be pressure perhaps to move sooner rather than later into situations which for the players, coaches, and fans could be more dangerous than they would have to be otherwise.
Yeah. Seems like the responsibility of the university is to not let, as strong as we feel our need is, to let the well-being and safety of the people who have to make the sports happen be the driving decision maker there.
Certainly we would expect Duke to behave, and Duke coaches and athletic directors to speak and lobby at their meetings differently than we would expect to see some others in some other kind of colleges do so. Yeah. In fact, we've heard some of those already. So.
Yeah. Well, we will see. We shall see. Let's see. So we know our questions. Let's see what questions other folks have been shooting our way while we've been talking. And I'm going to start with this one, which says, to what extent does this pandemic highlight ethical issues that already exist in college sports, where student athletes are generating so much revenue? I think this actually comes straight out of what where we just were. Are there particular ethical issues regarding player safety when the players are students as opposed to professionals?
Yeah, I mean, I would be inclined to think that it really is the same kind of issue. It's just, we've just been presented with a new reason for a dilemma, but insofar as lots of folks on lots of campuses will be perhaps trying to push for group activity involving athletes and involving spectators in stadiums and arenas before they will even insist on that in classrooms. That's, if we see that, then that will be, undeniable evidence that, undeniable evidence that we can't continue assuming that these are just student athletes that are just out kind of playing a game and that we treat like every other student. So I think, and there are a lot, so that we can see the dangers that the athletes would put themselves under just because of the virus. It's probably the coaches that have much more to worry about, and would also have, would find themselves having a difficult time to resist being forced into a situation that might increase their chance of getting the virus. But it does seem continuous with other dangers that, at least in some sports, athletes are subjected to.
So what do you think about some of those other dangers? I mean, is that something that you think about? This question makes me think about concussions, for example.
Yeah.
Right. And when you've recruited a student as a student athlete, right, and they take that hyphenated identity very seriously, and they want to play, like the sort of the matronly school marm in me defaults to a university's concern is for students as students first, right? That's got to be the primary thing. But if they've been recruited as athletes first, and that's what they want, like what are the kinds of considerations that institutions should be making when they try to help students navigate that tricky line?
Yeah, I think, concussions more than anything just seems to be the I don't know what the best metaphor, the pink elephant, huge pink elephant in the room. It just can't, there's just no getting around, the problems that raises, partly because it doesn't seem like one can really significantly mitigate that problem just with sort of piecemeal tweaking of, rules of football and helmet technology and things of that sort. And I don't think at any level of society, from Pop Warner leagues to the NFL to colleges to all of the industries that, feed off young people playing this game. And by young people, I mean 30-year-olds who are playing in the NFL as well. Those are young people to me now. So, well, for one thing, that's a whole episode of What Now? At some point, but yeah, that's like that issue alone is like the issue from last week of, when do you rip the ventilator off of Granny to give it to somebody else? That's just a hard nut to crack. Right.
And in both cases, it's like the immediacy of questions of health and trade-offs and decision-making with the pandemic shed light on those questions where they exist and where they have existed since before this, right? So
we can hope that this will go away eventually. It might be 2 years, but that the danger of the players and coaches and fans are subjected to by being so close together and exhaling so much, shouting so much, will disappear in a way that, concussions aren't going to go away. That problem has to be addressed in some other way. There's not going to be a vaccine for concussions.
Right. But if there were, imagine. The Rock's Ninja games would take on a whole new tenor. Okay, next question. What is the difference in meaning between watching live sports and replays? It seems to matter that we don't know the outcome for sure in live sports. Why does that matter?
So this has always bothered me for a long time. That because I do find that most sports matches, like most movies and most TV programs, are kind of okay and good, and you can often feel like it wasn't a waste of your time. And some are great, like in all those areas. And when you watch a great one, you sense that so many things that you like in any great performance, the drama, the insight into kind of human will and determination, the beauty, the human struggle, the the dealing with fate and unpredictable elements, and all of that seems to come alive in great sporting events. And so and so much of that seems to hinge on your not knowing how it's going to end, in a way that watching Hamlet doesn't. So, and that's always kind of bothered me. And there are some of those things where you will go back and watch it, but you could just look at viewing statistics to realize that not often, and not very many of us will watch whole games again where we know the outcome. And even, I'm somebody who always, very often, even for the most important matches in a sport, tapes them and tries and watches them later, and zips through the advertisements and halftime and all the rest of it. And you can watch an NFL game, everything in an NFL game, in 1 hour,
Right.
rather than 3.5. So, but then it's crucial that I cut myself off from the world, and that if my father phones me, the first words I say when I pick up the phone is, don't tell me the score. I'm not watching live. So it is troublesome that if there's all this incredible human drama going on, it shouldn't hinge quite so much on having to know not the fact that you don't know the outcome, but that is part of it. So.
And is that true? So you use the NFL as one example, but if it were like soccer, where it seems to me and again, I'm universalizing from myself, which is a bad thing to do, but where so much of the joy that I find in it is in just watching the grace of the movement and the moves in between. Like, soccer is not a game that's about the score. Maybe it's still about the outcome nonetheless, but it seems to me that so much of the fun is seeing what people can do. And that seems like it's re-experienceable.
And I do, I must admit that I do, I feel like I want to be a historian of a number of the sports that I love and that I've watched much of my life, really all of my life. And it is, fascinating for me to watch games from other eras and to watch whole games. And it doesn't matter if I know the outcome or not. Or older matches, or to see matches where current players who are retiring were young or something. So then I think I appreciate all of those things, but I think they don't turn out, I think, in general, to be a fix right now for sports fans. Like, you just don't see. I think maybe the MLB network was just replaying last season or something.
Oh.
I'm not sure many people.
Maybe you have to go back to the 7. Like, maybe you can't go back to the immediate past. That's the thing. So the next question is, should sports be treated as different from drama or music? Whereas drama or music or art or museums or panel discussions are treated as some sort of high art, only our panel discussions, dear questioner, or when these things are treated as high art, sports are trivialized, or at least the question of their possible triviality comes up. Do you see them differently? Would the Greeks or Romans have seen them differently?
Yeah, no, I don't see them differently. So I really want to believe that at the hours that I invest, I think lots of sports fans who have other things to do, like, for example, you and I almost always feel that there's a book that we should be working on more, or a paper, or a referee's report. And so there is this sense in which there's always an opportunity cost.
Right. All time.
The cost is to the important things of your life. Yeah. But I certainly feel that the drama and the qualities of the drama are real. I think the Olympics, which we're going to lose this year, are a good example. Like, nobody misses almost any of those sports for 4 years.
Right.
And you even kind of reluctantly are thinking, oh God, the Olympics are coming up again. I guess I'm going to have to watch, like, if it's winter, like luge and it's the Summer Olympics. It's like, you know, endless races of different kinds. But you know, the broadcasters, for better or for worse, do usually suck us in by telling us backstories, telling us how hard people have worked. And there's something about that moment where a pole vaulter or a shot putter or a sprinter or a swimmer or whatever are standing up, you know, the gun's about to go off, and this is the only thing that's mattered for the last 6 years of their life. Like, it has all, and it's incredibly true that that's everything. And whether it works, whether it's the thrill of victory or the agony of defeat.
You sound like Bob Costas.
Yeah, that you know, that it's real thrill and partly vicarious, and it's real agony that you see what it is for I mean, in a way, the beauty of sports in their purest form is that the thing that you're doing only has meaning because a bunch of you have agreed to let it have meaning. I mean, there's nothing intrinsically interesting about like putting a little white ball inside a cup that's 300 yards away. It's only because you've invested it with meaning. It only has meaning because of all of the things that you've kind of built around it. And that's real. That's why, that's, you know, same thing in many other art forms. That's you know, a person from 400 years ago couldn't just sit down and listen to great music that's being composed and performed and recorded now. They just wouldn't understand what's going on. They wouldn't be able to literally hear it, because all those things matter because we've created them and come to see that they matter. So yeah, I do think sports have all that at their best. And there's lots of bad art and bad
I was getting ready to say, yeah. as a like voracious consumer of really bad, like, well, most pop cultural products,
yeah,
say that these things run the gamut. All right, I'm going to put this as perhaps our last question. We'll see how we're doing with time. But how will sports organizations be able to ethically allow fans and spectators back into a stadium following this pandemic? What protocols should be followed?
Oh man, also who wants to go back? So I just saw, my brother sent me a poll today of 1,500 people in Canada about this. And one of the questions was something like, suppose in the fall, say in October or November, you were given a free tickets to a game of your favorite team. How would you feel about going to a live game and being there in the crowd? And the total response, and this is 1,500 people from a good polling agency across the country in Canada. So 28% would be fine with it, and 40% would probably go, but would think twice about it. And 32% would definitely avoid it. So, you know, more than 60%, even with our information now, you know, kind of are starting to get just the heebie-jeebies of thinking about being that close to people who are shouting and spewing their saliva several rows in front of them. So, you know, in some ways, if fans are reluctant enough, it makes it easier for the decision makers not to feel that they're you know, leaving so much money on the table, because especially the big time sports where they can think of feasible ways of doing them without crowds. But I think about, you know, I'm getting calls from my agent to renew my Duke football tickets. And so and I suspect that I'll renew them, but not go to the games. Like I'll renew them to give the money to Duke football, and probably even also we usually pay this extra bit that allows first responders to get free seats in a particular section, but maybe I don't even want them to go. But anyway,
and then just be sending them to work at this point.
Yeah.
So I think this question is a good question to end on. And I'm going to do this one, which is brings together different parts of your kind of intellectual courses, which are different parts of your intellectual self. Having thought about both nationalism and the ethics of sports, could you say something about the value of sports, positive or negative, with regard to nationalism and nation building? And how might this pandemic be disrupting that for better or for worse? It's a small question to close out on.
Yeah, well, so there a couple of quick and obvious things. So one of the most striking uses in recent years, in recent decades of the use of sports is hosting events like the Olympics or the World Cup, but in particular the Olympics or the Winter Games. And so, and they're precisely being used by nations in many cases to showcase what great advances they've made as a country, how modern they are. So they invest, untold billions in stadiums. They put in all sorts of infrastructure. I mean, Beijing was obviously, a prime example of this, but it's been done at least since Nazi Germany. Not to say that it's always, I mean, Australia did it in a very cuddly way in 1956. I mean, it was a very important moment in the history of Australian nation building where people who had in many cases been born British or British parents could embrace their cuddly koala-like Australian identity. It doesn't have to be an evil thing. But it was extremely important and successful in Beijing the way they did the Olympics. So the Japanese were investing a lot, and they were hoping to get that kind of boost, both internally of pride in what they had put on, and externally in terms of how because your national identity also depends in part on how others see you, and how you compare yourself to others. So that's kind of an easy thing. So there are going to be some big hits in that regard. But in general, sports have played roles in lots of particular nations and nation building, and in much the same way that basketball plays that role of identity building, the Duke nation building at Duke. I mean, probably the identical places in the brain are activated in the identical ways and help create that sort of lifelong identity and affiliation with an institution. But there are lots of sort of good and bad ways. One thinks about how important it was in America and in parts of America, probably later retrospectively than at the time of Jesse Owens winning the dash at the Munich Olympics and Hitler walking out. I mean, that was an important identity moment in America that came from that sport.
When the Atlanta Constitution refused to cover him. So they kept, I can't even remember the name of the guy that they willfully kept reporting on in lieu of saying Jesse Owens' name, precisely because they understood it was a struggle for who gets included in and embraced within.
Yeah.
And I think that on some level, what the pandemic will mean depends a little bit on whether or not we, as speaking as sort of the broad American community, respond with generosity or fear, and which sense of that sort of we can imagine the community beyond our computer screens, beyond our homes and our connection to it, or we are going to shut down and pull in. And you see those tensions all the time. You see the same people careening between those two impulses. And I think it's hard to predict at this moment which of those impulses will dominate. Maybe they'll continue to be this sort of bounce back.
I mean, and we do know that in difficult economic times are often, the occasions for which various nationalist entrepreneurs of the less admirable sort often are given fuel. But although we can think of sort of better examples also where in hard times people have pulled together in ways that are enduring and admirable. So we'll have to see how our political class plays it.
Right. Yeah. Which version of the Great Depression of the New Deal, the Roosevelt years, do we want to call for? Okay. So we are at our time. I want to thank you, Wayne, for this conversation. I want to thank you, audience, for hanging in there with us. Please come back. We'll be here again next week. And remember, we will be sending you a link to the recording of this video and other links to continue joining us. So thanks, everybody, and see you later.
Thank you very
And
much,
May
Adrian.
Norman, I will see you on campus someday when we are
Yeah.
on campus again.
And I'll be silently in the background for the next one, like everybody else.
You should ask a question. You'd be like, I have a question about
Yeah.
sports, he says.
Thank you very much for doing these too.
Oh, I love it. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.